In a quiet cul-de-sac obsessed with appearances, one neighbor's crusade to control everyone else's lives spiraled into deception, investigations, and a spectacular reversal that exposed the real rule breaker. Before starting, like the video and subscribe the channel for more. The trouble began on an unusually calm Saturday morning, the kind of morning where birdsong competes with the soft hum of distant lawnmowers and the air carries the faint scent of freshly cut grass. In the middle of that peaceful backdrop, the rhythmic tapping inside the narrator's garage, gentle, measured, and entirely ordinary, became the spark that ignited a storm no one saw coming. The workshop was small, modest and cluttered with reclaimed wood, old tools, and weekend projects meant more to pass time than to impress anyone. Yet, to one particular neighbor, the mere existence of those tools felt like a threat to the curated serenity she believed she controlled. She was known throughout the neighborhood as the unofficial overseer, the chronic observer, the human surveillance camera who seemed to catalog every car model, every trash bin placement, and every blade of grass deemed too tall. She carried herself with the authority of someone convinced she had been chosen by an unseen council to protect the integrity of the community. No one had ever appointed her, of course, but that didn't stop her from acting like she had dominion over every door hinge and mailbox post within a 2-block radius. The narrator had only recently moved into the quiet cul-de-sac, unaware of the delicate balance maintained by the residents who had long learned to coexist with this woman's relentless oversight. They had become accustomed to her walking the sidewalks each morning with a clipboard, jotting down supposed violations or peering across lawns with the scrutinizing intensity of a tax auditor. Some laughed her off, others avoided her entirely, and a few attempted to placate her with overly polite greetings that did little to deter her routines. The workshop itself was harmless, a simple setup for woodworking, a hobby that brought calm after long weekends. Even so, the neighbor's eyes fixated on the open garage door as though witnessing a code violation of catastrophic proportions. The narrator noticed her lingering gaze, but assumed it harmless. After all, it was just a garage and a couple of tools, not a construction zone or a commercial operation. But that passing glance marked the beginning of a series of events that would soon disrupt the entire neighborhood. The first complaint came 3 days later, delivered in the form of an unexpected visit from a city inspector. He arrived with a clipboard in hand, wearing the expression of someone accustomed to walking into situations fueled by exaggerated grievances. His tone was professional, almost bored, as he explained that the city had received a report of allegedly unauthorized commercial activity occurring within the garage. The narrator was stunned, but cooperative, allowing the inspector to glance inside and observe the simple arrangement of hobbyist tools, unfinished wooden shelves, and paint cans. He seemed almost embarrassed to be there, as though aware he was participating in a charade orchestrated by a meddlesome neighbor. Once he realized there was no business being run, no clients coming and going, and no machinery louder than a common household appliance, the inspector left with a polite nod. He mentioned that false complaints were rare but not unheard of. The narrator thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The second complaint came a week later, this time claiming that the narrator was storing hazardous chemicals. Again, an inspector arrived, and again found nothing more concerning than wood stain and a few solvents common to any garage. The third complaint alleged excessive noise, though the inspectors arrived on a day when the workshop sat silent and unused. Each visit fell flat, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. The inspectors, by this point, treated the narrator with a mixture of sympathy and irritation, not directed at him, but at the situation itself. Neighbors began to notice. Whispers traveled from driveway to driveway, carried through hedges and over fences. People who had once kept their heads down now exchanged knowing glances whenever an official vehicle parked along the curb. Some offered reassurances, others alluded to past incidents involving the Busybody, and a few confessed they were relieved the focus had finally shifted off them. The narrator maintained patience, understanding that escalation would only feed the chaos. But beneath the calm exterior brewed a growing frustration, a bewilderment at the relentlessness of the neighbor's campaign. It wasn't simply about the workshop, it was about control, and she had chosen the new resident as her latest target. As the conflict quietly intensified, the neighbor watched from behind her curtains with satisfaction, convinced her vigilance was protecting the neighborhood from imagined threats. Her confidence swelled with each inspector's arrival, feeding a narrative only she believed. But karma, as it often does, was already shifting into motion, preparing its slow, deliberate correction, and its first signs would appear sooner than anyone expected. The tide began to shift on an early weekday morning when a different city vehicle pulled into the cul-de-sac. Unlike the previous inspectors responding to noise or chemical complaints, this one bore markings from the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. Its arrival created a subtle ripple among neighbors, peering from their windows, curious, but cautious not to be seen as too invested. Two enforcement officers stepped out, carrying equipment and forms that suggested a more thorough investigation. They weren't here for a simple noise check or visual sweep. Their posture, alert but composed, signaled something more formal. The narrator assumed it was yet another complaint, possibly another attempt by the busybody neighbor to elevate her accusation to a new department. He braced himself for yet another explanation, another inspection destined to reveal nothing of concern. But the officers didn't approach the narrator's property. They walked straight past the driveway, bypassed the garage entirely, and headed directly toward the busybody's home. The effect on the neighborhood was immediate. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open just slightly, people paused mid-step on their morning dog walks. The atmosphere rippled with the hesitant excitement of communal curiosity. The narrator watched from across the street, realization dawning slowly. Someone or something had finally redirected the scrutiny. The officers knocked on her door. For several seconds, there was no response, though the faint sound of hurried movement inside was unmistakable. Eventually, the door opened just wide enough for her to stand framed in it, arms crossed, posture rigid, face composed in a practiced expression of concern. She appeared ready to deliver the same clipped explanations she had rehearsed countless times while lodging her complaints. But the officers weren't there to hear her accusations. They were there to address hers. A brief exchange occurred, muffled words, clipped phrases carried by the breeze just enough to hint at tension. The officers gestured to the side of her house. She hesitated. They insisted. Reluctantly, she stepped aside, allowing access to her property, and that was when the first signs of her own violations came into view. Behind her house, partially hidden by a leaning lattice fence, was a collection of items that should never have been there. Improperly stored lawn chemicals, rusted equipment, and an assortment of discarded containers and debris. Each piece might have been shrugged off individually, but together they formed a pattern unmistakably aligned with code violations, serious ones. It appeared this wasn't their first visit to her property. The officers carried documentation referencing previous warnings, unresolved notices, and long-ignored deadlines. For years, she had pointed fingers at others while neglecting her own responsibilities. Her facade of order and control masked a growing list of overlooked infractions. What no one realized until that day was that her repeated complaints had triggered internal auditing within the city departments. Each time she filed a report, the city logged her name, her property address, and the nature of her accusations. When complaints become excessively frequent or suspiciously repetitive, a review is triggered, and during that review, the city discovered her unresolved citations. The narrative she had constructed of being the vigilant protector of the neighborhood began to crumble in plain sight. Word spread quickly, not through gossip, but through simple observation. People saw the officers taking photos, measuring distances, recording violations. They watched her pacing behind them, hands wringing, her composure fading by the minute. She tried pointing toward the narrator's home as a diversion, attempting to lean on her familiar role as whistleblower. But the officers politely redirected her. They weren't interested in complaints today. They were only interested in her violations. The message was clear. Her behavior had finally caught up with her. Meanwhile, the narrator remained on his driveway, watching the spectacle unfold. It wasn't schadenfreude exactly, more a sense of balance restoring itself. The neighbor had wielded fear and authority irresponsibly for years, and now the consequences were arriving like a long overdue reckoning. The officers issued orders, citations, and deadlines. They pointed to her backyard, they pointed to her storage shed, they pointed to areas she had assumed were invisible or inconsequential. Each moment chipped away at the persona she had meticulously crafted. By the time the officers left, the once confident busybody looked shaken, her shoulders drooping, her face pale beneath the morning sun. Her home, once regarded by her as the standard-bearer of neighborhood order, now stood marked for review. And the neighborhood, sensing a shift in power, felt something it hadn't in years: relief. But the unraveling was not finished. Something else was brewing, something deeper that would bring the situation to its climax.
In the days that followed the enforcement visit, the atmosphere of the cul-de-sac changed dramatically. The tension that had once hovered over the neighborhood began to lift. People no longer watched the busybody's daily patrols with dread. In fact, she no longer patrolled at all. Her once meticulous morning walks ceased abruptly, replaced by hurried trips between her front door and her car, always with a wary glance over her shoulder. The enforcement officer's visit had been the first fracture in her carefully constructed authority, but karma had much more in store. As part of the citations issued to her, she had been required to clear out her backyard, properly dispose of hazardous materials, repair her failing fence, and remove unauthorized structures. These tasks were neither optional nor mild. The city imposed strict deadlines and scheduled follow-up visits. For a woman who thrived on controlling others but rarely tended to her own responsibilities, the workload was overwhelming. Her backyard soon became a spectacle in its own right. Piles of discarded containers appeared at the curb, old metal pieces were dragged out from behind the shed, clattering loudly enough that neighbors paused to watch. The fence, once hidden behind layers of decorative vines, was revealed to be rotting and unstable. The cleanup uncovered issues the neighborhood hadn't known existed, problems likely years in the making, concealed beneath her obsessive focus on everyone else's behavior. The more she worked, the more her facade crumbled. Neighbors passed by on walks, pretending not to stare, but clearly observing the transformation. She no longer held the invisible social authority she once wielded. The power dynamic had flipped completely. The narrator, meanwhile, continued his workshop hobby as usual. With no more complaints filed, the peaceful rhythm of woodworking resumed. The garage door remained open on weekends, not as a provocation, but as a symbol of normalcy restored. Occasionally, neighbors strolled by and commented, without dialogue, through nods or appreciative gestures toward the progress of a woodworking project or the lack of chaos that had once plagued the street. Then came the second enforcement visit. This time, the inspectors were thorough, reevaluating every citation issued weeks before. The neighbor's attempt at compliance was evaluated piece by piece, and though she had made visible efforts, the officers discovered several major issues she had failed to correct. The rotting fence still did not meet safety standards, a few containers of prohibited chemicals remained improperly stored, and documentation she had been ordered to provide had never been submitted. The inspectors noted everything formally. Their expressions carried no sympathy, only procedural neutrality. She seemed desperate, hovering near them, attempting to justify why certain tasks had not been completed. But the process was beyond negotiation. She had used the city's resources irresponsibly for years through baseless complaints, and now the system was simply responding with the same unwavering rules she had once weaponized. When the officers left, they did so after issuing a final notice, one that included penalties and the possibility of escalating consequences if she continued to ignore orders. The neighborhood quietly absorbed the news, though few dared to discuss it openly. There was a collective awareness that something significant had occurred. The self-appointed enforcer had finally lost the narrative she had spent so long cultivating. The final act of karma arrived a week later, delivered in the form of an official posting placed neatly on her front door. It informed her that due to unresolved violations and repeated noncompliance, she would be subjected to mandatory inspections until every issue was corrected. This included random checks and potential fines increasing with every missed deadline. Once the notice went up, her behavior changed completely. Gone was the constant surveillance of her neighbors. Gone was the parade of petty accusations. She no longer hovered near windows or patrolled the sidewalks. Instead, she spent her days tending to her own property, finally turning the critical gaze inward instead of outward. Ironically, the neighborhood thrived in her newfound silence. People walked their dogs without fear of being monitored, kids played in driveways without her looming presence. Even the lawns, long subjects of her scrutiny, seemed greener, perhaps because they finally grew without judgment. Weeks later, the narrator noticed her backyard had finally been cleared, her fence replaced, her home meticulously repaired. She had become the kind of neighbor she had once demanded others be, and in doing so she had learned a lesson the city, the neighborhood, and karma itself had collectively delivered. Control has a cost, and when wielded irresponsibly, it inevitably circles back. The workshop remained open on weekends. The peaceful tapping of tools once again harmonized with birdsong, no longer an irritant, but a symbol of the neighborhood's return to balance. The cul-de-sac settled into an easy rhythm, one restored not by conflict, but by consequences. And as for the busybody, she stayed quiet. Her former authority dissolved, her reign over the neighborhood, finally, decisively, ended.